I have with me today a familiar face. People are probably used to seeing the two of us together, so it won't surprise anybody that we hit record on one of our catch up calls. But the backdrop being, I have been handling a number of buyouts and breakups, and since launching the law firm, there's been a lot of stuff that has been negative related to partnerships that it's had me contemplating, like, well, what actually makes a good partnership from the beginning, and how do you create success rather than stuff that ultimately ends up being a breakup at the finish line. And so I thought no other person should I have this conversation with than somebody that I would deem an incredible partner and one of the best partners I could have ever imagined having. And for those that do not know, the background is Jeremy and I were the co-founders of Enlighten, had a 5-year really awesome run that ultimately ended in us selling the company to Weed Maps and having a great exit. But I think taking the exit out of the picture, I think just the backdrop and the partnership was something that I never would have imagined to be as seamless and perfect as it was over the time. And so I am probably one that doesn't view partnerships in a vacuum, because I've had the luxury of having one that I've seen go so well that it makes it much different when you see others and like, well, why isn't that one going well? My frame of reference is probably a little off, but I digress. You're the better storyteller, so rather than me ramble, why don't you give the background on kind of how we met and your perspective on our story?
Well, yeah, and before I do that, just so everybody knows, earlier in life I tried a couple of partnerships. They crashed and burned about like 90% of the ones that I've seen, and I was kind of gun shy to partnerships and had been a solo CEO and founder for years, and was kind of allergic to it. And then one day I get this call from this charming attorney down in Texas, and he says, "Hey, I did this, and I might get some of this wrong, but I think this is my version anyway. I did this deal, an M&A deal for a digital signage company, and they made like $1 gazillion off like a handful of screens. And like, how do you make money off of this many screens?"
The hell
And
is this industry?
crazy. And so Kobe had been calling around to a lot of people in digital signage, and I had been in digital signage since the beginning. It's 2008, the first TV menu in the United States of America, maybe the world. I put in David's Steakhouse in Corbin, Kentucky in 2009. And so most of the people in the space, it's a relatively small space, small world. And so a lot of people brought my name up and said, "You should meet this guy." So this guy calls me from Texas. Kobe calls me from Texas and says, "Hey, I want to come up and meet you." And I'm like, "Who are you? What are we talking about?" And so, he made himself familiar and flies up to Texas literally next week, very aggressive, and says, "What are you working on?" And I had been working on three
You
different.
probably never had somebody in the office dressed like me either.
Never, never had anybody with those short breeches and no socks. And this is Kentucky. Everybody's got on boots when they walk in
Yeah.
here. And so, I should take fashion advice from you, but the so Kobe walks in, and we meet each other. We talk a little bit about digital signage, and I said, "Yeah, I got 3 projects going on. One was in minor league baseball stadiums, building an ad network there, which appealed to him, being a sports guy. I'm not much into sports, and so it didn't have much appeal to me. There was one in payday lending stores, and that one was growing, but obviously that's not a great market. It's disadvantaged people financially. And the other one was in cannabis, and so we talked it out of what we thought, and marijuana was only going to become legal once, right? And so there was a lot of advantages, and that's where it began. He's like, "Hey, let's start working together."
And you're
And
missing the part where I was like, ah, cannabis, like, get out of here. And somehow over the course of like 3 hours, you take me from like, not a chance, that's the one we're picking, to somehow that's the
that,
one we're picking.
that was a thing. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
So it's like a daily cannabis
Little,
consumer.
little
And then
rope a dope on me.
yeah, and this guy who wouldn't touch it for nothing still can't convince. It's legal now, and still won't do it. I don't know why, but yeah. So it did take a little while. I think what really triggered you though was you have a background in finance and law, and the ability to raise capital for this was going to be extremely easier. The ability to see investor hype and excitement when we go to exit was going to be, amazingly easier. And then also just from a market penetration standpoint, you're pioneering, so there's no competition
I
walking
think
in.
that was it. It was a nascent market, right? Like the idea of being first is always super awesome.
100%. That's and as you know, we've been friends now forever. That's like if I'm not first, I don't even want to play. Usually, like if
Ricky Bobby, if you're not first, you're last.
yeah, that's it. Take it back, baby. So
Yeah.
and that's, that's the way I look at markets. If I'm not first in, I don't really want to play catch up. I want to be the guy setting the pace of the race. And so that's a big deal. And so, yeah, I guess for me, what was interesting for the first time is to begin to learn to let go of certain aspects. And so, when you're talking about what makes a good partnership, there's about 5 or 6 things that, when you tell me we were going to talk about this today, I thought about. But the first one is really beginning to respect the other individual and identify their strengths and just decide my ass didn't need to be inside a spreadsheet no more. That's, Colby owns all things in the universe that gets spreadsheeted. All things with numbers, Colby owns that. That is where that goes. If somebody says spreadsheet, I just point that direction and go over there. And I think for Colby, like an equal thing or legal related, a number of things. I mean, I just brought that one up. But, and if it's technology, go talk to Jeremy. If it's sales, talk to Jeremy, sort of things. And so identifying like, where are the strengths? Because what's the point of a partnership, right? It's for someone to
But
fill that in.
even right there, the thing that I've noticed and I hate about partnerships is where you step in day one and say, this is what I do, this is what you do. Because what that misses and what we didn't have the issue with, but I've seen others, is like you actually have to earn trust and
Yeah.
earn somebody's respect that you have a specific skill rather than just showing up and be like, this is what I do. Because like you may not actually know what you're good at. And so what we did that I actually thought was awesome is like we kind of just started blindly feeling around and was like, oh, well, I stink at this and he's pretty good at it. I shouldn't. Right. And then you watch and they end up being excellent at it. And all of a sudden it's like pieces kind of fall in place. But I think it's like a lot of times people show up and are like, I do this. And it's like, do you, or do we need to assess like who in this partnership is best at what?
Well, the way we did that was sort of like the dating in the beginning. We were at every meeting together for a while. Like
Forever.
we took no meetings apart until we began to be like, they'd say there's a sales call and you'd be like, is Jeremy going? And they'd say, yeah. He said, well, I'm not going now. He's got that. And I'd say, there's this thing we need to, do an analysis on. I was like, is Colby been told about it? Like, yeah, he started working. I said, well, then you don't need me. But it took a while to get there. And we were in every meeting with one another so we
How
could
long do
learn
you think? I was trying to recall, like at least 6 months is where my head is at.
at a minimum. And then
Yeah,
even after that, like for another year, it was 70% of meetings we were
totally.
sitting
I
in. And
agree.
so you think about how expensive those meetings are, but the bottom line is I'm looking at certain things in this meeting and you're looking at other things in this meeting. And so we were able to gather two entirely different perspectives. And we would always, every meeting we had with someone else was a meeting we had with each other outside of that meeting to discuss what was going on in that meeting
My
usually.
phone. My phone. How many minutes have you called this month? 1,999 to Jeremy, one to somebody else.
Yeah,
Uh,
I remember that.
but
Yeah.
but I think in that vein, the thing is like to your point, I think going to all those meetings together, being on the phone together is like a necessary piece of the puzzle because I'm sitting there not only trying to do my part, but watching how you do stuff, picking up tips, but also like, again, building that level of trust. And you can't do that unless you're actually in it together on the calls and
Well,
stuff.
and a byproduct of what you're talking about is, you learn technology skills, you learn some sales things. I learned a huge amount of legal knowledge. I gained a huge amount of finance and spreadsheet knowledge. And then what was funny to me, and kind of this is how you made it, is when the two of us would be in a document together. And that was just magical to
Like ninjas.
watch. It was like ninjas. We would be
Yeah.
like, oh, we got to put this thing together to go talk to such and such about whatever. And we would dive in a shared document, man. And I just knew what you were going to do. You knew what I was going to do. Boom, 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 boom. And what would have took us individually hours and hours is knocked out in 10 minutes together. And so, and the way I look at that, it's almost like, the things we're talking about right now, if you want to correlate it to something, is a healthy marriage. It's
Totally.
it's it's the same thing. It's like you're parenting together. You both go to the parent teacher meetings. You both go to the t-ball games. You both go to these places, and the child ends up better, and you have a better succinct relationship. You're not having to catch up, and you learn from each other. And so it's if you want to talk about partnerships, well, the most fundamental one on the planet is the marriage. And
Yeah.
so look at that.
And I think beyond trust, it's like gaining that fundamental understanding of how people think and operate, which takes time. Because if you don't understand how somebody thinks and operate, it's hard to begin to try and make sure you're doing stuff that won't step on toes, or make sure you're doing stuff that jives with the other person's kind of roadmap and thought process. And I think you hit on something that I hadn't thought of in my kind of mental notes I was thinking through, is like we joined so many calls together. And I think had we not dove headfirst into like gaining that intimate knowledge and trust, like probably the stuff that you would outline as good partnership items probably don't even fall into place because you can't even get there.
Yeah. So, I mean, what kind of commitment do you want to make to this partnership? At the end of the day. And I could see certain partnerships where one guy's the sales guy, the other guy's an engineer, and, you go sell it and I'll go build it. So I'm not saying that every partnership in the world needs to be that way, but, you really need to understand each other, because after a while, somebody could say something to me and I would say, well, this is how I feel about it, and this is how Colby's going to feel about it. And then they could go ask you, and that was precisely what you would say, because I learned, how you think. Another thing I think that's important, other than just the time that you spend with each other to begin to understand each other's skills and then let them do that and let go of that and let them know that, and I guess it's sort of part of that is ego. Well, actually, really, rather the lack thereof. Like you're not allowed to have one. And you don't have to rub in each other's face, hey, I'm good at this or whatever that is. You've got to just get yourself out of the way, because when you're in a partnership, when you're a solo entrepreneur, you are the business, right? But when you're a partnership, the business is bigger than you as an individual. And so that's where the ego gets to exist. You get to be proud of the company now, not so proud of yourself, and let those things get in the way. And we both did that. We were proud of each other too. That was what was really cool. Like, we pumped each other up to people. We talked to When we were introducing each other, we were proud to introduce one another, say, hey, this is Colby, and he's amazing at this and that. And would really pump one another up. So rather than having, a looking inward ego, our egos were for each other and for the business. And
And
that's,
nobody ever took credit for anything. I can't remember one time where either of us was like, I need credit for X, or I did this, so I need to make sure everybody knows I did X. If it helped the business, we didn't care, right? Like, I, at the end of the day, could care less what anybody thought of me as long as the business ended up getting where we thought it could go.
yeah, it was interesting. We would always say, look what we did, even if it was just one of us that did it, or,
For
it
sure.
didn't make any difference. Look what we did. And so it's saying, if you're going to get in a partnership, even as a solo entrepreneur, if you're not in a partnership, it's important to get ego out of the way, but it's absolutely critical in a partnership, because all that's going to do is drum up a bunch of animosity. And, now you're keeping score, right? Which I get was another concept I kind of wanted to talk about is, you need to both know you're working as hard as you can work, but we don't need to be keeping score, because everybody views keeping score differently than the other one. And so that is a trap you can fall into, scorekeeping.
And everybody magically thinks their contributions are more than anybody else thinks that
Isn't
they
it wild?
are.
Yeah.
So you can't. Uh,
The eye is always the smartest guy in the room, right?
the other one that I had on my list that I thought was interesting was there's zero chance you can get from point A to point B without some conflict or some disagreement, right? Or
Mhm.
in our case, probably 1,000, right? But the
Yeah.
interesting thing was I can't recall one time in whatever 6 years where the disagreement wasn't sorted amicably and quickly without it going to like, well, this is, I'm in control of this, so I have final say, or I own more of the company, so I have final say. It was like
Yeah.
whoever ended up putting forth the best argument won. And it was like, and it would happen in 30 minutes.
Yeah, it would happen really quick. And even if it wasn't the best argument, I can think of times we disagreed, but I'm like, I just don't feel like
Not
dying
worth
on
it.
this
Yeah,
deal.
not
I'm
worth it.
not dying on this deal. This doesn't mean that much to me. You can have
Totally.
it, whatever. I think you're wrong, but I guess we'll see. But
Totally.
and so sometimes you just let it go. It's like, is it are all of these things really important? And the answer is no, because the most interesting thing about entrepreneurship is the way that it actually plays out. Is the only thing I know for certain is it's not how you planned it. That's the one thing that doesn't play out. It plays out similar, maybe, but not how you planned it. So you can't get caught up in those disagreements, because whatever you think is going to happen is not what's going to happen. So why distress about it and fight about it?
And from my perspective, the one thing was like, it's so hard to build a company that if you don't maintain momentum and if you're like quarreling over something and it causes delays in decision making by 60, 90 days while you hash stuff out, like you're toast. If you lose 2 days of momentum, you're probably toast. So from our perspective, it was like momentum ruled over finality of decision making, and it was like we just got to keep moving.
Well, that kind of touches on another, because I was in my mind walking into this correlating it to a marriage a lot. And so what you're talking about for me sort of relates to the way that if a couple is, not that we're in love, but if a couple's in love and they display that and they're always supportive of one another, well, then the children are a lot happier. And the children learn that they should be supportive of one another. So they're nice to their brothers and their sisters, and they're nice to mom and dad. And then the rest of the world, the community, the people, at the school or the church or whatever you do, they see that. And so they're like, oh, those are great people. They're so supportive of one another. And it just builds this image that's infectious, and it grows. It's like, hey, those guys really work together and cooperate. And people said that about us all the time, even post acquisition. Like that was one of the things. And so here's a company worth billions of dollars that buys us, and they bought a bunch of things. And what I heard all the time from them is like, this acquisition is different. Like, here's these two partners, man, and they jive, they get along, they support each other, and they've got a very supportive community here among their employees. And that's not, what I heard about the other acquisitions. That wasn't the case.
And the interesting thing on that, because it kind of dovetails into nobody that is in the rungs below you, whether that's C-suite, whether that's on the rungs, but you can't actually come to one of us and be like, hey, I'll backdoor something, I'll go against somebody and use the other one, like, because you see this, like, going back to your parent situation, you'll see kids that will use one parent to get what they want, and it creates a rift. But like, if
Yeah.
there's zero way that you can crack the founders or the kind of partners, it's impossible for anybody to be like, well, I'll pit them against each other, because it's a futile effort. You can't do it, right? So I think that's actually interesting, because it also creates or eliminates the quarrels below, because they're like, it's not even worth it. I know I can't create some coup or some workaround if I try and go to one and not the other.
No, not at all. And then, and sort of also on that parental unit sort of ideology. I mean, it's no surprise to you or to me that some of them liked you better and some of them liked me better. And if we were a single unit, then there'd have been half of these people that really didn't like me or like you, and that wouldn't work out. But since we're two entirely different people, don't know we could be any more different. They always had someone that they felt that they could trust, that saw the world the way that they did, that they could go to. And so that was a big advantage. Not that we're going to talk about why to have a partnership, it's how to have a good one, but that it was because of that I think that we had such a diversity in employees.
And I think so. Let's use that, because the other thing that I was trying to solve for people to think about when they hear this is the pitfalls. So we've kind of hit on a few of the here's the good things to have in there, what makes a good partnership, but there's pitfalls, and the biggest one that I have seen is like, so you two do the same thing. You both come from an investment bank, or you both come from a technology company, and you're both developers. It's like you need difference in skill set, but you also need differing personalities, because to your point, like, you and I couldn't be more different, both in background, skill set, personality, and like we got along, but like we had pick your flavor between everybody else. It's like you kind of just migrate to the one that you fit closest to. But I think that's valuable and helpful if you don't have like that level of diversity amongst the partners or founders.
I don't even know why you would be in a partnership. Like it doesn't,
And
I
yet
could.
there are so many of them that are structured that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe like in a law firm, for example. Like if you're a personal injury law firm, you're all going to be personal injury lawyers.
Yeah,
If
right.
in a doctor's office, you're all going to be foot doctors and a foot doctors. But outside of those sort of things, yeah, if you're building a business that's going to have multiple departments and different technicalities and those sorts of things, you've got to have a diversified skill set. And somebody's got to watch the numbers, and somebody's got to make sure the money comes in, and somebody's got to build the products. And so you need to lay out like, what are these things, and do we as founders together and partners, do we cover these squares? Because what's the point in the partnership if like you're both just salespeople and neither one of you even know how a product gets
And
made?
I
What
think
is
a true exercise of like laying out here's the 20 things that we're going to have to accomplish to get from point A to point B. Who is good at 19 out of the 20, right? Like some things
Yeah.
you can hire somebody else to handle, but almost all of them you needed to cover between the founding team or the
Yeah.
partners. Yeah. And then to reiterate one from earlier, ego. Like I think that's a huge pitfall. Ego, hubris, redundant skills. Anybody that starts to lean on the original legal documents is probably that's things aren't heading the right direction, right?
Yeah, that was an interesting thing between us to talk about partnerships. Like there was zero sentiment anywhere between us that either one of us was ever going to screw the other one over. There wasn't even a moment in a meeting where one of us said something to the other that was crassed in a way that made it feel like that poison was in the atmosphere. And so no, leaning back on, hey, here are the original documents. Da, 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 da. There
Yeah.
were times you and I, we had documents and we had to like go back and redo things, because life just changed and we were
Right.
willing to both change with it. Like there were several times that there were asks on both sides, and it's like, and that's another good part about good partnerships. Neither one of us were afraid to go to the other one and say, hey man, I think we need to change this thing because it's not, we had an idea of what it was going to be and it's different than that now, so let's like get it back to fair and equitable. And we weren't afraid to have those conversations.
And I think regular checkups is like, because that's one thing is people will become resentful if it's like, man, I feel like I'm doing 10x the work and I'm the minority partner or I'm a 20% owner or whatever it may be. And that can fester and become problematic if you don't nip it in the bud. And so I think if you're having regular conversations of like, hey, we'll take care of stuff, or hey, our relationship is strong enough that we'll sort this in the finish line. But also if that's not the type of relationship that you have, saying, hey, every 6 months we should sit down and reassess and make sure we're on the same page.
Well, you and I
We
used to
didn't
do.
need the 6 month thing because I think we just we're in tune to be like, hey, we'll sort this when it needs to be sorted. But I think some people that probably is helpful to have like a cadence.
Well, we had our own version of it. I don't think we had to sit down and talk about us, but we would, every on a quarterly, semi-annual, or annual basis, we would always. And I just got done with one for one of my other companies. It was a year-end review. It's like here's a brutally honest review of what has happened in the last 12 months. This is not a document made to make anybody feel good about themselves. This is not a document made to make anybody feel bad about themselves. This is a document based upon fact. And as partners, that was pretty important, to be able to go back and look at that because we may have had different viewpoints on what had occurred in the past, not just what was going to go on in the future. And how you view the past is going to impact how you make decisions for the future. So we did have resets, just not how we felt about each other, but more about how we felt about the business. Like it didn't matter how you felt when we drummed that document up. This was the CAC. This was the growth trajectory
Yeah.
that we had. This was the revenue that came in. This was the source of that revenue. This is where the product advanced. And it wasn't squishy. It wasn't wishy-washy. It was very quantitative and factual. And it's a solid reset so that you both not only align on the future, but you agree on the results of the past because it can get blurry if you don't lay it out that way, right?
Yeah, and I think those regular, and we did this probably more than anybody, that at least any other company that I've seen was like, hey, we're going to assess what has happened in X period of time, looking back, and we're going to realign on what is the path going forward, and if we need to make changes, we'll make changes. But like that was something that we were doing at least
Regularly.
quarterly from like a proper perspective, but probably bi-monthly from just like a heat check perspective. Like, are we still on the same page? Are we viewing the future the same? Are we viewing the roadmap the same?
Yeah, and I don't know if this has to do with partnership so much, but it probably does. So it's helpful that our personality profiles, and I use the Myers Briggs a lot. There's a lot of different personality profile tools out there. I suggest anybody going into a partnership go through some of these assessments because there are absolutely toxic personality combinations that are not going to work, and there are ones that do work. And so our personalities just meshed, and to the point where you're talking about doing an evaluation and planning for the future. I'm an ENTJ. And
Yeah, we
so,
both are
yeah, exactly. And so abandoning bad ideals is in our DNA. Like that is like as soon as we decide this is a shitty thing to do, we don't want to be involved in it. We're done with it. And we've left, we've invested money. We both understood what sunk cost meant. It's like, yep, not giving that thing any more money.
and
Not
yet
ready.
nobody was ever pinned. That was your shitty idea that we just canned. It was just a bad idea that we agreed that was on the roadmap that's now no longer on the roadmap.
That's why we had to agree on everything. So
Yeah.
that way nobody got shitty
Totally.
ideals.
Yeah.
You can't point at me. We agreed on this,
Yeah.
man. So this is what happened. And boy, did we have a lot of shitty ideas. We had to get through a whole lot of them to get to the good stuff.
For
You
sure.
know.
But I think so. If you're thinking of do's and don'ts and you're segmenting it out and two young founders or soon to be partners of business or deciding whether they're about to sign the documents and become partners. Like the dues, if I'm recapping right, is gain trust and understanding, actually be in the room together or
Come
be on the
together.
call together all the time so you actually understand what each other's good at. Then you have actually aligning on past, aligning on future, making sure that there's no egos involved. The don'ts then become redundant skills, points of friction and personality that it's quite obvious that it'll never work out, and starting to try and take credit or not take credit for things. What am I missing?
One thing we didn't talk about in this way, but you can't undermine each other, nor can you allow anyone to undermine the group of you. Which we did talk about it as a group, but I think it was an unspoken thing. So you got to eliminate the ability for any undermining.
Yeah, united back to back all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's, I mean, any company goes through good times, bad times, whether it's a tech startup that's got to get through product market fit, whether it's a business partnership that is tackling micro P or small business stuff. Like everything is not always rosy, so you better be standing back to back and working your way through it.
It's actually not rosy about 95% of the time.
Yeah, I was
And
trying
you're
to
saying,
for the people that haven't founded a company before.
yeah, well, you can pretend it is. We pretended a lot. We
Yeah,
made a lot of small celebrations. If you don't celebrate the small wins, you're not going to make it as a partnership either, because there are going to be really bad days and bad seas. And so you got to take time to celebrate those small
in the
wins.
celebrating too, the last one that I'll throw out that popped in my mind was, I will say us traveling together as much as we did help. So a lot of people are now remote; they're not in the same cities with founders. We were not in the same city, but we traveled so much together over those first few years, and we traveled in a way that we were like attached at the hip for 5 days straight. And I think
Yep.
that goes a really long way because then you're not just business only partners, but you actually are becoming personal and friends and the like. And I think that also goes a long way because in a remote age, it's easy just to get on, be business partner, and not actually go have dinner and celebrate the wins and do stupid stuff and everything in the personal side of the thing.
Well, I think the first outing we had, me and you put down about $2,800 with the king salmon belly in the Pacific Northwest over a 5 day span at Canacon.
Yeah,
So I think that was the first real trip for us. I also remember some not so great ones when somebody booked us in what they thought was a hotel in New York and we were in a hostel. That was
yeah.
great.
Hostels not even in Manhattan. But that's part of it, right? Like you go through those things together, and I think that actually adds a lot of value to the partnership. So
Yeah,
um in the interest of, you and I could talk for 3 hours, but in the interest of
we
keeping
did for 5 years.
indeed. But I think we hit it. Like that's the stuff that, from my perspective, you need to think about and you need to be doing. And good partnerships, if you do it right, will amplify you to the nth degree. Because solo founding is exhausting and terrifying, and like it's really nice to have somebody you can lean on the bad days. So
Yeah.
I will always be an advocate of having partners, but you got to be smart about who you pick.
I would also argue, kind of, as my last closing thought here, we weren't integral in one another's lives outside of the business. And so if things did go bad, it wasn't like our kids go to school together, and we weren't intertwined, right?
Totally,
And so knowing that a lot of partnerships fail, not that you're going into one fail, but if I was looking at a partnership, I would be very cautious about that. Mixing family and business, or mixing friends and business,
totally,
because you could lose more than a partner in that process. And if they're not your friend, so to speak, and they're not your family, then it's more business at the end of the day. And if you can get through all that, now you and I are friends, right? But it was straight business. Like we weren't really friends in the beginning. We were conducting business. And I believe that family and friends relationships could very much hinder that. So, not that I've ever made that mistake, but I've seen a lot of people make it. And so I would caution people going into partnerships, if you've known this person a long time and you have a very personal relationship with them, you could end up losing two things: a business partner and a friend. And so, give that some thought.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, business breakups are keeping us busy at the firm, so I see lots of them, and I can concur that doing it with a family member can make that unwinding even more complicated and tricky.
Is that sort of like the funeral home of businesses,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
breakup attorneys? You're
yeah,
like the
yeah.
funeral director of businesses.
Exactly.
Oh
But
man.
no, man, as always, good to see you. Super appreciative of you letting us hit record on one of the 3 trillion phone calls we've had.
Yep. Well, good luck in all the business breakups. I hope you put this out and no one breaks up. I'm sure that's not good for the firm, but hey, at least you're trying to let people know what not to do in the beginning, right?
Exactly. Exactly.